Before there was a town called Hawkins, before there were children with psychic powers or men who played God in secret labs, there was another place, a dimension just next door, a shadow world existing in a state of primordial, chaotic twilight. It was a silent, waiting abyss, a place of potential without purpose. This is the timeline of that place, the story of how a quiet, mindless dimension was given a brain, a will, and a purpose, and how it was twisted into the ultimate weapon in a war against our world. This is the entire story of the Upside Down. Now, let's rewind the clock back to a time before the first crack in the wall, to the very beginning of the darkness. The origin of the place we call the Upside Down is a mystery not even its eventual king fully understood. It existed long before it had a name, long before it had a mind. Think of it as a photographic negative of our own world, a dimension existing in a state of arrested development. It was a place of deep, profound silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through decaying, vine-choked forests and the distant, electrical crackle of reality itself. For eons, it was a dimension of pure potential, a canvas without a painter. Its landscape was a monochromatic hellscape, a world perpetually locked in the moments just after dusk. The sky was a roiling storm of red lightning and black clouds, a ceiling of raw, untamed energy. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of strange, organic matter, a web of pulsating vines and tendrils that acted as a kind of planetary nervous system, responding to stimuli but without a central consciousness to process the information. The air was thick with floating, snow-like spores, the pollen of a world where life and decay were one and the same. It was a dimension without a sun, without stars, a world lit only by the faint, sickly bioluminescence of its own flora and the angry, violent flashes in the sky. It was a world of echoes. Some theories suggest it was always a dark mirror of our own dimension, a veil of shadows, as the boys' Dungeons and Dragons lore would call it, a place that reflected our own geography but was devoid of the life and warmth that defined it. The familiar landmarks of Hawkins, the quarry, the schools, the houses, may have existed there in some form, but they were like abandoned stage sets, crumbling and wrapped in the tendrils of this other world, waiting for actors who would never arrive. The ecosystem of this primordial Upside Down was simple and brutal. Life existed, but it was alien, predatory. Creatures we would come to know as demobats flitted through the dark skies, their screeches the only sharp sound in a world of low rumbles. Larger, more formidable predators, the things we would call demogorgons, stalked the decaying forests, alpha hunters in a world without prey. They were a part of the dimension's natural, albeit terrifying, order. They hunted, they nested, they lived and died according to a simple, brutal biology. But there was a key difference between this early Upside Down and the one we would come to know. There was no hive mind. The creatures were individuals acting on pure instinct. The vines pulsed with a mindless energy. The dimension was alive, but it was not sentient. It was a body without a brain, a kingdom without a king. It was a place of raw, untamed power, a dimension of pure chaos waiting for a force of order to be imposed upon it. It had no goals, no ambitions, no hatred for the bright, noisy world that existed just a thin veil of reality away. It simply was. For countless millennia it remained in this state, a silent, dark neighbor, completely unaware of us, just as we were of it. It was a loaded gun that had been sitting on a table since the dawn of time, waiting for a hand to pick it up. The problem with a place of pure chaotic potential is that it is, by its very nature, suggestible. It is clay waiting for a sculptor. The story of the Upside Down as we know it, its story as an antagonist, a villain, a force with a will, does not begin with its own creation. It begins with the arrival of its mind. The origin of the Upside Down's evil was not born from within. It was violently injected from our world, a transplant of human darkness into a body of primordial chaos. And that transplant, that first sinner in this unholy garden, was a troubled, powerful boy named Henry Creel. For uncounted ages, the Upside Down was a dimension of mindless chaos. It had no center, no will, no purpose. That all changed on a day in 1959. This was the first great catalyst, the inciting incident in the dimension's own dark story. It was the day a powerful, new, and utterly alien consciousness was violently injected into its very fabric. From the perspective of the dimension itself, it was a moment of profound, world-altering shock. In Hawkins, Indiana, a young telekinetic girl named 11, in a desperate act of self-defense, had just defeated a boy named Henry Creel, a boy of immense psychic power and even greater malice. She did not kill him. Instead, she opened a wound in reality, the first true gate, and cast him into the abyss. As Henry's body hurtled through the swirling, chaotic vortex between worlds, the Upside Down felt his arrival like a lightning strike to a planetary brainstem. He was a foreign body, a psychic virus, but he was also something the dimension had never known, a sentient, ordering intelligence. The raw, untamed energy of the place was immediately drawn to him. The red lightning that had previously crackled without purpose now had a target. It swarmed him, striking his body, not to destroy it, but to change it, to remake it. The very atmosphere of the Upside Down began to fuse with his physical form. The pulsating vines and tendrils, the building blocks of this world, were attracted to his power, wrapping around him, burrowing into his flesh, integrating his human biology with the dimension's alien flora. It was an agonizing, terrifying metamorphosis. His skin was burned away, his features dissolved, his human form twisted and reshaped into something new, something monstrous, a grotesque fusion of man and dimension. This was not a rejection of the foreign body. It was an act of symbiosis. The dimension, in its mindless, chaotic state, had found a mind. And the mind, Henry Creel, had found a body, a kingdom of infinite, malleable potential. The immediate psychological fallout of this event, for the dimension itself, was a shift from chaos to a nascent form of order. Henry's consciousness, his rage, his nihilism, his profound desire to impose his will on the world became the new operating system for the Upside Down. The creatures of this world, which had previously acted on pure, individual instinct, suddenly felt a new presence. They felt a pull, a commanding voice in the back of their primitive minds. The demobats, the demogorgons, they were no longer just animals. They were becoming soldiers. The network of vines and tendrils that covered the landscape, once a simple, reactive nervous system, now had a brain to connect to. It began to pulse in unison, a single, rhythmic heartbeat, echoing the will of its new master. Henry, now reborn as the being who would one day be called Vecna, was the nexus. He was the center of a new planetary consciousness. The dimension was no longer just a place. It was an extension of his own body, his own will. The chaos began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating purpose. The dimension had been dormant for eons, a sleeping giant. Henry Creel's arrival was its violent awakening. The first major catalyst wasn't just the birth of a monster, it was the birth of a sentient, hostile dimension. The loaded gun had been picked up, and for the first time, it was aimed. It was aimed directly at the world that had cast him out, the world he was now determined to conquer and remake in his own dark, orderly image. With the arrival and transformation of Henry Creel, the Upside Down had, for the first time in its existence, a mind. This new consciousness, which we will call Vecna, did not see a hellscape. He saw a world of pure, raw potential, a kingdom of clay that he could mold to his will. The rise of this key figure was synonymous with the rise of the dimension itself as a unified, hostile force. His first act as the nascent king of this new realm was one of exploration and conquest, not of territory, but of consciousness. Vecna spent what could be considered years in a timeless dimension where such measurements are meaningless, wandering his new domain. He was an explorer, mapping the contours of his own extended body. He tested the limits of his new form, a grotesque but powerful fusion of his human psyche and the alien biology of the Upside Down. He found that his own telekinetic and telepathic abilities were now magnified 1,000-fold, amplified by the raw psychic energy of the entire dimension. He was no longer just a powerful boy. He was a god in a world of his own making. His primary discovery, the one that would define his entire strategy for the coming war, was his ability to connect with the native life forms. He reached out with his mind and touched the primitive consciousness of the Demobats, the Demogorgons. He didn't just command them, he absorbed them. He brought them into his own mind, making them extensions of his will, eyes and ears for his new kingdom. This was the birth of the hive mind. The once individual creatures of the Upside Down were now nodes in a single, vast, interconnected consciousness, with Vecna as the central processing unit. The dimension, once a place of chaotic, competing instincts, was now a perfectly ordered, unified army. The faction was born. Vecna, a being obsessed with order, began to impose his own twisted aesthetic on the chaotic landscape. He found that he could manipulate the very substance of the dimension, shaping the organic matter, directing the growth of the vines and tendrils. He needed a throne room, a capital for his new empire, and he knew exactly what it would be. He chose the one place that held the most psychic resonance for him, the site of his first great act of purification, his childhood home. Using his power, he began to shape the fluid, suggestible reality of the Upside Down into a dark, decaying mirror of Hawkins, Indiana. At its heart, on a lonely, floating island of rock, he meticulously reconstructed the Creel house. It was a perfect, nightmarish replica, a monument to his own dark past and his even darker future. The attic of this spectral house became his sanctum, his command center, the place from which he would wage his long, patient war. The relationship between Vecna and his new dimension was one of perfect symbiosis. The dimension gave him a body an army, and near limitless power. He, in turn, gave the dimension something it had never had, a purpose. That purpose was vengeance. His hatred for the world that had rejected him, for the girl who had banished him, became the dimension's own driving force. The entire Upside Down was now fueled by his personal, nihilistic rage. The challenges he faced were not internal. His control over his new kingdom was absolute. The challenge was the veil, the thin but resilient barrier of reality that separated his world from the one he sought to conquer. He was a king trapped in his own castle, a general with a massive army, but no way to cross the border. So he began to listen, to watch. He used the hive mind as a massive sensory organ, pressing against the veil, searching for any weakness, any crack. He was a patient predator, a spider in the center of a dimension-sized web, waiting for a fly to touch one of its strands. The rise of Vecna was the rise of the Upside Down as a character in our story, transforming it from a passive, environmental threat into an active, intelligent, and deeply malevolent antagonist. The first major conflict for the newly unified Upside Down was not a battle, but a long, meticulous, and patient act of creation. Vecna, now the undisputed king of his dimensional empire, understood that he could not yet wage a direct war. He was a general without a bridge to the battlefield. So he began to build one. The conflict was between his immense will and the stubborn resilience of the dimensional barrier. His goal was to find a way to project his influence, to touch the world he had been cast out of. The opportunity arose from an unexpected source: the continued experiments of Dr. Brenner back in Hawkins. Brenner, having lost his prize subject Henry Creel, had moved on, creating a new generation of psychic children. He was still trying to punch holes in reality, to access the very dimension Vecna now commanded. Every time one of Brenner's new subjects, especially the immensely powerful 11, would touch the void, they would create a small, temporary psychic tear, a pinprick of light in Vecna's darkness. These were not stable gates, but they were a connection. Vecna learned that through these fleeting connections, he could do more than just peer into our world. He could influence his own. He discovered that the Upside Down was suggestible, that it reacted to the psychic energy bleeding through from Hawkins. He found that he could use the psychic residue of Hawkins to shape the raw material of his dimension. This was the beginning of his greatest construction project. The conflict was one of creation and imitation. He began to meticulously sculpt the Upside Down into a perfect, dark reflection of Hawkins. It was a slow, painstaking process. He used the memories and psychic echoes of the town to build a spectral, decaying version of every street, every building. Main Street, the quarry, the middle school, the buyer's house. All were recreated in his dark, monochromatic palette. This was not just an act of mimicry. It was a strategic decision. He was building a staging ground, a familiar terrain, upon which he could one day fight his war. The dimension was no longer just a wild alien landscape. It was becoming a twisted, haunted parody of a small American town. The aftermath of this long creative conflict was the establishment of a fully realized and weaponized Upside Down. The dimension now had a defined structure, a capital city, the spectral Creel House, and a perfectly mirrored battlefield. The ecosystem was fully militarized. The Demogorgons were no longer just alpha predators. They were his elite soldiers, his scouts, his assassins. The Demobats were his eyes in the sky, a vast surveillance network. The vines and tendrils were his nervous system, his communication network, connecting every part of his kingdom back to him. The dimension was no longer just an extension of his body. It was a fully operational war machine. The stakes were redefined. Vecna's goal was no longer just to escape or to take revenge. It was now one of total conquest and consumption. He saw our vibrant, chaotic world of individuals as a flawed, messy creation. He would replace it with his own perfect, orderly, silent world. A world where all life was connected to a single, superior mind. His. The Upside Down was the blueprint for the new world he intended to create. His victory would be the merging of the two, the overwriting of our reality with his own. He spent years in this state of readiness, his new world poised and waiting. He was a god-king on his throne, watching, listening, patiently waiting for the one thing he knew would eventually come. A gate. Not a pinprick, not a temporary tier, but a real, stable doorway, one big enough to finally begin his invasion. The first major conflict wasn't a battle fought with soldiers, but an act of will, the transformation of a chaotic dimension into a perfect instrument of war. The stage was now set. All he needed was for his old enemy, 11, to make one final, catastrophic mistake. The period between the establishment of Vecna's kingdom and the opening of the first stable gate in 1983 was, for the Upside Down, a long, quiet, and deeply patient lost era. It was a time of cold, silent preparation, a rebuilding phase where the dimension was not just a weapon, but a weapon being constantly sharpened and refined. From the outside, nothing was happening, but from the perspective of the hive mind, this was a crucial period of observation, study, and strategic planning. Vecna, on his throne in the spectral Creel house, was a king in waiting. His daily life, if such a term could be applied, was a state of expanded consciousness. He was not confined to his physical form. His mind was the dimension. He saw through the eyes of every demobat, felt the ground through every pulsating tendril. He was a silent, omnipresent warden, maintaining the cold, perfect order of his new world. The entire dimension was in a state of suspended animation, a perfectly disciplined army waiting for the call to war. The trauma of his own transformation and banishment was not a source of pain, but the very foundation of his philosophy. He meditated on his own hatred, keeping it pure and focused. He revisited the memories of his life as Henry Creel, not with regret, but with a sense of righteous validation. He saw humanity's flaws, its hypocrisy, its sentimentality, and it reinforced his belief that his mission of cleansing was a necessary, almost holy one. He was not a monster. He was a savior, and his trauma was the sacred text of his new religion. The secrets of the Upside Down during this era were its evolving capabilities. Vecna learned more about his connection to the dimension. He practiced his control, honing the hive mind into a flawless instrument. He could coordinate the movements of 1,000 creatures at once. He could perceive every corner of his dark kingdom simultaneously. He was also learning about our world through the small, fleeting frontiers created by Eleven's training at Hawkins' lab, he was able to gather intelligence. He was a psychic spy, listening in on a world he could not yet touch. He learned its language, its culture, its technology, all filtered through the lens of his own contempt. He saw a world of noise, of chaos, of meaningless conflict, and it deepened his conviction that it needed his clarifying, silent order. His isolation was absolute and desired. He had no peers, no allies, only subjects. He was a singular consciousness in a universe of his own design. This solitude didn't drive him mad. It purified his purpose. There were no dissenting voices, no conflicting ideologies. There was only his will. The rebuilding of his plan focused on a single, critical problem, the barrier between worlds. He knew he could not break it from his side alone. The energy required was too immense. He needed a door to be opened from the other side. So, he waited. He knew Brenner's ambition. He knew of Eleven's immense, growing power. He understood that it was only a matter of time before Brenner pushed her too far, before she created a wound in reality so deep it could not be healed. The entire dimension was poised for this moment. The Demogorgons, his prime hunters, were kept in a state of readiness near the areas of weakest dimensional stability, places that corresponded with the location of Hawkins' lab. The upside down was a coiled spring, its tension building over 2 decades of silent, patient waiting. It was a long, dark, and quiet era, the deep breath before the plunge. The dimension was no longer just a reflection of Hawkins. It was a loaded gun pointed directly at the town's heart, its trigger waiting for the hand of a small, frightened girl. The reemergence of the upside down into the narrative of our world was a sudden, violent, and long-awaited event. In November of 1983, it happened. Dr. Brenner, in his reckless pursuit of psychic espionage, pushed 11 too far. He forced her to make direct, unshielded contact with one of the Upside Down's native predators. The resulting psychic explosion of pure terror was the key that finally unlocked the door. From the perspective of the Upside Down and its sentient mind, Vecna, this was a moment of triumphant arrival. For 24 years they had waited, listening to the faint whispers from the other side. Now, a scream had torn a hole in the veil. A massive, stable gate ripped open in the sub-basement of Hawkins' lab. It was a bleeding, pulsating wound in reality, a physical bridge between the 2 dimensions. The sensory details of this moment, for the Upside Down, would have been a flood of new, intoxicating information. The light, the air, the sounds, the very smell of another world poured into its own dark, silent reality. It was a moment of profound sensory shock and opportunity. The first to act was one of the Demogorgons, a creature that had been waiting patiently near this dimensional weak spot. Drawn by the psychic energy and the scent of a new world, it became the Upside Down's first soldier, its first explorer, stepping through the gate and into the cold, sterile environment of Hawkins' lab. This was the first physical manifestation of the threat. The new idea, the new strategy, was no longer one of waiting, but of active invasion. The first act of this new campaign was the abduction of Will Byers. As the Demogorgon hunted its way through the lab, and out into the woods of Hawkins, it encountered the boy. Vecna, sensing this through the hive mind, would have recognized something in Will. A sensitivity, a psychic resonance that made him a valuable target. He was not just food, he was a potential anchor, a living key that could be used to widen the gate, to strengthen the connection. The Demogorgon was given a new command: capture him. The abduction of Will and the subsequent killing of Barb Holland were the first overt acts of war, the first tangible signs to our world that something was terribly wrong. The suspense, from the Upside Down's perspective, was in the exploration of this new, alien world. The Demogorgon was a scout in enemy territory, its every experience being fed back to the hive mind. Vecna was learning about Hawkins through the senses of his predator. He learned about its layout, its weaknesses, its inhabitants. The town itself was the new battlefield. The Upside Down began to exert its influence in subtle ways. The lights in the buyer's house flickered, not randomly, but as Vecna, through Will's captive consciousness, attempted to understand and manipulate the technology of this new world. He was a god learning a new language, the language of electricity and light bulbs. The reemergence of the threat was a carefully calculated, opportunistic assault. The opening of the gate was a gift, and Vecna was not one to waste an opportunity. He immediately began to probe, to test, to establish a foothold. The quiet, waiting war was over. A hot war had begun. The Upside Down was no longer just a shadow, it was a physical presence, a hostile power that had finally, after decades of waiting, set foot on our soil. With a stable gate open and a physical presence in Hawkins, the Upside Down's new order was one of active, if clumsy, invasion. The dimension, through its Demogorgon soldier and its captive, Will Byers, began to wage a multi-front war, creating chaos and sowing fear. This new order, however, immediately ran into a series of unexpected internal conflicts, namely the fierce and surprisingly effective resistance from a small group of children and a grieving mother. The Upside Down's primary tool was the Demogorgon. From Vecna's perspective, this creature was a perfect soldier, strong, relentless, and completely loyal to the hive mind. Its mission was to hunt, to kill, and to terrorize, weakening the town's resolve and gathering intelligence. The creature's movements, which seemed random and monstrous to the people of Hawkins, were, in reality, guided by the cold, calculating intelligence of Vecna. It was drawn to blood, a simple biological imperative that made it an effective hunter. It took Barb, it attacked Nancy, it terrorized the buyer's house. Each act was a strategic probe, a test of the enemy's defenses, but the creature was just the physical arm of the operation. The more subtle and important front was the one being waged through Will Byers. Held captive in the Upside Down, Will became a living conduit, a psychic bridge. Vecna used him to try and communicate, to manipulate the world he had left behind. This was the source of the flickering lights, the strange phone calls. It was the hive mind trying to interface with a foreign technology, a god trying to figure out how to work a telephone. This created a new social dynamic, a terrifying one, between a mother and her captive son. Joyce Byers, with her Christmas light alphabet, was engaging in a direct dialogue with the Upside Down, a feat of maternal intuition that Vecna would have found both fascinating and deeply frustrating. The primary internal conflict for the Upside Down was the underestimation of its opposition. Vecna, a being of immense power and supreme arrogance, could not comprehend the strength of human connection. He could not understand why a group of small, powerless children would risk their lives for their friend. The party, Mike, Lucas, and Dustin, and their alliance with the escaped 11, became a persistent, infuriating thorn in his side. They were a variable he had not accounted for. 11, in particular, was a source of great conflict. From Vecna's perspective, she was his creation, the one who had banished him, the one who had opened the gate. She was his nemesis and his key. Her immense power was a direct threat to his soldier, the Demogorgon. Her ability to enter the void and psychically locate Will was a breach of his security. She was a rogue element, a piece on the board that moved according to its own rules. The chemistry of the human resistance, their loyalty, their love for one another, was a concept alien to the cold, singular consciousness of the hive mind. It was a strategic weakness he couldn't exploit because he couldn't understand it. He saw individual, fragile creatures, not a cohesive, powerful unit. The fracturing of the boys' party, the arguments between Mike and Lucas over 11, would have been seen by Vecna as a sign of their inherent weakness, a confirmation of his belief in their flawed, chaotic nature. He failed to see that these conflicts would ultimately be resolved, their bond strengthening in the face of a common enemy. The new order of the Upside Down was one of invasion, but its first campaign was already being hampered by an enemy that fought with weapons it didn't have: love, loyalty, and hope. The first campaign of the Upside Down's invasion of Hawkins reached its critical turning point with a series of tactical failures and one shocking, unexpected victory. The primary objective had been to use the Demogorgon to soften the target and to use Will Byers as a permanent anchor between worlds. Both plans were about to go catastrophically wrong, culminating in a final confrontation that would force Vecna to completely re-evaluate his strategy. The villain's trap was, in this case, his own arrogance. Vecna, through the hive mind, had become aware of the human resistance, but he continued to underestimate them. He failed to see the convergence of the different factions, the kids, the teenagers, and the adults, into a single, coordinated fighting force. He saw them as separate, weak units, and this was a fatal miscalculation. The turning point began at Hawkins Middle School. 11, using the makeshift sensory deprivation tank, had successfully located Will in the Upside Down and confirmed Barb's death. This act of psychic power was a massive flare that drew the full attention of both Brenner's forces and the Demogorgon. The ensuing chaos at the school was, from the Upside Down's perspective, a target-rich environment. The Demogorgon, drawn by the blood of the slaughtered lab agents, crashed the party. Vecna's soldier was now face to face with his greatest enemy, 11. The final fight in the classroom was a tactical disaster for the Upside Down. The Demogorgon, a creature of immense physical strength, was ultimately no match for 11's focused, sacrificial power. Vecna, watching through the eyes of his creature, would have witnessed its utter annihilation, its body atomized by a force he recognized all too well. This was a shocking revelation. He had been defeated by her once before, as Henry Creel. Now, His most powerful soldier had been destroyed by her as well. The loss of his primary physical asset in the human world was a major strategic blow. Simultaneously, another failure was unfolding in the Upside Down itself. Hopper and Joyce, having breached the gate, had found Will. They removed the tendril from his throat and resuscitated him, severing Vecna's primary psychic link to the boy. The plan to use Will as a permanent gateway, a host, had failed. The loss of the Demogorgon and the rescue of Will Byers represented a near-total collapse of the Upside Down's first invasion plan. It was a catastrophic tactical failure. But in the midst of this defeat came an unexpected twist, a moment that would change the course of the war. In the act of destroying the Demogorgon, Eleven had expended so much energy that she had seemingly disintegrated along with it. In reality, the psychic backlash had thrown her through a temporary rift and into the Upside Down. For a brief period, the ultimate weapon of the enemy was now trapped within Vecna's own domain. This was a stunning turn of events. The being who had just thwarted his plans was now a prisoner in his kingdom. This presented a whole new set of possibilities and problems. Could he find her? Could he control her? Or was her very presence in his world a new, even more potent threat? The critical turning point of Season 1 was, for the Upside Down, a moment of profound defeat, but one that ended with a shocking cliffhanger. The board had been reset, his primary pieces had been removed, but he now had the enemy's queen trapped on his side of the battle. The first campaign was over, and it was a failure, but the war was about to enter a new, even stranger phase. The fall and transformation of the Upside Down strategy was a direct result of the catastrophic failures of its first invasion. The primary figure of this transformation was not Vecna himself, but his unwitting pawn, Will Byers. Though rescued, Will did not return from the Upside Down alone. During his time there, particularly in his final moments with the tendril down his throat, he had been infected. A piece of the Upside Down, a seed of the hive mind, had been planted inside him. The transformation of Will Byers from a victim into a host was the centerpiece of the Upside Down's new, more insidious strategy. The physical fall of the Demogorgon led to the rise of a more subtle form of attack. Vecna, thwarted in his attempt at a direct physical assault, now had a new asset, a spy on the inside. His internal monologue from his throne in the spectral Creel house would have been one of cold, calculating adaptation. His first plan was too crude, too simple. This new opportunity was far more elegant. He could use the boy's own body, his own senses to see and hear the human world. He could learn his enemies' plans, their fears, their weaknesses from the inside out. The external pressures of the closed gate and the loss of his physical soldier forced this evolution. He could no longer kick the door down, so he would find a key that was already on the other side. Will became that key. The boy's episodes, his sudden, terrifying flashes of the Upside Down, were not just PTSD. They were moments where the gate in his mind was being pried open, allowing the hive mind to look through his eyes. The final choice of this new strategy was not just to observe, but to possess. Vecna began a slow, creeping colonization of Will's consciousness. He used the boy's trauma, his fear, as a fertile ground to plant the seeds of his own will. The true sight visions were Vecna's way of maintaining and strengthening the connection. He would show Will the upside down, show him the new, colossal form he had created to project his will, the mind flayer. This avatar, a swirling vortex of black particles shaped like a monstrous spider, was a terrifying symbol of the hive mind's power, a bogeyman designed to terrorize and break the boy's spirit. The transformation of Will was a slow, agonizing process. He began to feel what the hive mind felt. He felt its hatred of heat, its desire to spread. He became a human barometer for the Upside Down's influence. This transformation from a simple victim to a possessed spy was the core of the Upside Down's new campaign. The fall of the brute force strategy was the rise of the psychological one. Vecna was no longer just a monster hunter. He was a master of infiltration, a psychic virus that had found its perfect host. This new methodology was far more dangerous, as it turned the hero's greatest strength, their love for Will, into their most profound weakness. They couldn't fight the monster without hurting the boy they were trying to save. The Upside Down had learned, adapted, and transformed its entire approach to the war. It had lost a battle, but in doing so, it had found a way to win the war from within the enemy's own command center. The introduction of the Mind Flayer avatar was the introduction of the Upside Down's new and improved war machine. After the failure of the lone Demogorgon, Vecna understood that he needed a more sophisticated way to command his forces and project his will. He could not be physically present, so he created a proxy, a field general for his interdimensional army. This new antagonist, the Mind Flayer, was not a separate entity. It was a pure, focused extension of Vecna's own consciousness, a puppet woven from the very fabric of the Upside Down. Its design, a colossal spider-like creature made of swirling black particles and red lightning, was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, a form born from his own childhood fascination with spiders and tailored to be the ultimate nightmare. Its introduction into the narrative was through Will's visions. It loomed over the spectral landscape of the Upside Down, a silent, terrifying god, its presence a constant torment to the boy. The story's trajectory was fundamentally altered by this new figure. The threat was no longer a single, physical predator that could be trapped and killed. It was now a vast, intelligent, and seemingly ethereal consciousness, a being that could command armies and possess minds. The stakes were raised from a town-level horror story to a potential apocalyptic invasion. The Mind Flayer's methodology was one of a total psychic domination. Its primary skill was its ability to control the hive mind with perfect, terrifying efficiency. It commanded a new breed of creature, the smaller, more agile demodogs, not as individual hunters, but as a coordinated pack, a swarming army that could overwhelm any defense through sheer numbers and speed. The Upside Down strategy, under the command of the Mind Flayer, was a two-pronged assault. The first was the physical invasion. The demodogs began digging a massive network of tunnels beneath Hawkins, a physical extension of the Upside Down's corrupting influence into our world. These tunnels, lined with pulsating vines and filled with toxic spores, were like arteries, pumping the lifeblood of the dark dimension into the soil of Hawkins. The rotting pumpkin patches were the first visible symptom of this subterranean cancer. The second prong was the psychological invasion through the complete possession of Will Byers. Will became the Mind Flayer's ultimate spy, his mind a conquered territory. Vecna, through the Mind Flayer, could see what Will saw, hear what he heard. The heroes were operating in a command center that had been bugged by the enemy's highest authority. This new antagonist forced the heroes to adapt. They could no longer rely on simple traps and brute force. They had to fight a war of minds. Their attempts to communicate with the real Will, to exorcise the monster from him, were a desperate form of psychological warfare. The introduction of the Mind Flayer as the face of the Upside Down's new campaign was a masterful evolution. It was a way for Vecna to be present on the battlefield without ever having to leave his throne. It was an antagonist that was both a physical army and a psychic virus, a multifaceted threat that was far more dangerous and far more intelligent than the simple predator that had come before it. The Upside Down was no longer just knocking on the door. It was tearing down the whole house from the inside out. The second major conflict for the Upside Down was its first full-scale military campaign against Hawkins, a coordinated assault aimed at achieving a single critical objective: opening the main gate at Hawkins' lab wide enough for the Mind Flayer avatar to come through, an act that would begin the final conquest and merging of the two worlds. The conflict was a masterclass in the hive mind's new strategic capabilities, but it would ultimately end in another devastating, unexpected defeat. The campaign began with the Mind Flayer using its spy, Will, to set a trap. It fed false intelligence through Will, luring a team of Hawkins' lab soldiers into the tunnel network, where they were ambushed and slaughtered by the Demodog army. This was a demonstration of the hive mind's tactical cunning. It then used the ensuing chaos to draw the entire Demodog pack directly to the lab itself, creating a siege. From the Upside Down's perspective, this was a perfectly executed plan. All of its key enemies were now trapped in a single location: 11, Hopper, Joyce, and the other children. The goal was to eliminate them all, especially 11, the only being capable of closing the gate. The battle at the lab was a stunning display of the Upside Down's military might. The Demodogs were a relentless, swarming force, overwhelming the lab's defenses with sheer brute force and numbers. The Mind Flayer was the perfect general, coordinating the attack from afar through its connection to Will. But the heroes, through a combination of courage and sacrifice, most notably the heroic death of Bob Newby, managed to escape the lab, taking Will with them. This led to the second phase of the conflict: the exorcism. At the Byers' house, Joyce and the others managed to force the piece of the Mind Flayer out of Will's body by overheating him. From Vecna's perspective, this was a significant blow. He had lost his spy, his inside man. The shadow monster, expelled from Will's body, flew back to the Upside Down, a psychic retreat. But the main army and the gate were still in play. The final phase of the conflict was the battle for the gate itself. As Hopper and 11 descended into the lab to close it, the Mind Flayer, now blind but still in command, sent its remaining forces to stop them. The Demodog pack, diverted from its attack on the Byers' house by the kids' risky mission in the tunnels, raced to the lab for a final, desperate stand. The climax was a stunning defeat for the Upside Down. while Hopper held off the charging demodogs, 11, tapping into a deep well of anger and love, unleashed the full, untamed force of her power. Vecna would have felt this as a direct psychic assault. He watched through the collective senses of his dying army as this single girl, his own creation, once again did the impossible. She didn't just push back, she slammed the door shut. She used her power to cauterize the wound in reality, sealing the gate completely. The psychic shockwave of this act was catastrophic for the Upside Down. The connection was severed. The Mind Flayer avatar was banished. And every single demodog, every vine, every extension of the hive mind in the human world instantly died, their life force extinguished. The second major conflict was a total, unmitigated disaster for the Upside Down. It had thrown its entire army at Hawkins and had been defeated by a handful of humans and one very powerful girl. The loss was absolute, a devastating blow that would force the hive mind and its master back to the drawing board. The closing of the gate by 11 was a devastating loss for the Upside Down, a strategic and military catastrophe that resulted in the complete collapse of its second major invasion. From Vecna's perspective, sitting on his throne in his spectral home, this defeat would have been felt as a profound, agonizing psychic wound. It was not just the loss of a battle, it was the loss of his army and, most critically, his access. The sacrifice from the Upside Down's point of view was the entirety of its deployed forces. The Demodog army, which had been meticulously grown and commanded, was annihilated in an instant. The severing of their connection to the hive mind was a mass extinction event, a psychic decapitation that left their bodies to rot in the tunnels and labs of Hawkins. The vast subterranean tunnel network, a physical manifestation of the Upside Down's cancerous growth into our world, withered and died, its fleshy walls decaying, its corrupting influence receding. The greatest loss, however, was the banishment of the Mind Flayer avatar. This was more than just the loss of a field general. It was the loss of Vecna's direct psychic projection, his primary tool for command and control. The colossal shadow monster was forced back into the Upside Down, its form dissolving, its power in the human world completely neutralized. This was a deeply personal defeat for Vecna. He had been thwarted once again by the same girl, the same sentimental, emotionally driven child, who had been his undoing from the very beginning. The emotional weight of this loss, for a being of pure, cold intellect and rage, would have been immense. It would not be grief in the human sense, but a cold, burning fury, a deep and abiding hatred that was now completely, singularly focused on 11. She was the anomaly, the chaotic variable that his ordered, logical mind could not account for. She was the living embodiment of the human sentiment, love, sacrifice, friendship, that he so deeply despised. And that same sentiment was the source of a power that had now defeated him twice. The tension in the Upside Down in the aftermath of this defeat would have been a quiet, seething one. The hive mind was still active, but it was now trapped, a king locked in his castle with no way out. Vecna would have spent a considerable amount of time in a state of cold, analytical rage, replaying the events, studying his failures. He would have recognized the patterns. His brute force approach with the Demogorgon had failed. His more sophisticated infiltration and possession strategy had failed. Both had been defeated by the same person. This devastating loss forced a fundamental shift in his thinking. He could no longer rely on his creatures, on his avatars, on finding and exploiting existing gateways. He had to evolve. The sacrifice of his army and his connection to our world was the necessary crucible that would lead him to his darkest, most powerful, and most personal strategy yet. He had to stop trying to kick down the door. He had to learn how to build his own. The psychological fallout from the Battle of the Gate was, for the Upside Down and its master, a period of forced hibernation, strategic reassessment, and a deepening of its singular obsessive hatred for 11. The gate was sealed, the army was gone, and the dimension was once again isolated, a kingdom without a bridge. The morale of the hive mind, a concept intrinsically tied to Vecna's own will, would have been at an all-time low. It was the quiet, seething frustration of a god who had been repeatedly thwarted by mortals. But in this defeat, Vecna found a new clarity. His previous strategies had a fundamental flaw. They all relied on a single, vulnerable point of entry. The gate at Hawkins' lab was a doorway that could be closed. He needed a new method, one that didn't depend on a single, physical location. He needed to find a way to create his own doors. His strategy shifted from a military one to something more akin to a dark ritual. He began to study the nature of the barrier between worlds, not as a physical wall, but as a psychic one. He realized that it was weakest not in places of high energy, but in places of deep human suffering. Trauma, guilt, shame. These were not just emotions. They were psychic wounds, fissures in the consciousness of an individual that he could potentially exploit. The relationship between the Upside Down and the human world changed. It was no longer an invader trying to breach a fortress. It became a predator patiently stalking its prey from the shadows, waiting for them to wound themselves. From his throne in the Creel house, Vecna began to observe Hawkins, not as a town to be conquered, but as a population to be dissected. He could still feel the faint echoes of the hive mind's connection, a residual psychic link that allowed him to sense the emotional state of the town. He was a shark sensing blood in the water from miles away. His focus shifted from 11 as a barrier to be destroyed to 11 as a case study. What was the source of her power? He had always believed it was anger, pain, the same dark emotions that fueled him. But her ability to consistently defeat him suggested something more, something he couldn't comprehend. He began to see her not just as an enemy, but as a puzzle he had to solve. The grief and anger he felt after his defeat were channeled into a cold, meticulous, and patient new plan. He would no longer send his soldiers to fight. He would become the weapon himself. He would use his own immense telepathic abilities to reach across the dimensions, to touch the minds of the weak, the traumatized, the broken. He would turn their own minds into the gateways he needed. The psychological fallout from his defeat was not despair. It was a dark epiphany. He had found his new methodology. The Upside Down would no longer be an army. It would be a curse. The final push for the Upside Down was the culmination of Vecna's decades of planning, failure, and evolution. His new plan, born from the ashes of his defeat at the Starcourt Mall, was his masterpiece, a dark and elegant ritual designed not just to open a gate, but to shatter the barrier between worlds forever. The preparation for this end was a psychic hunt. Vecna, from his sanctum in the Upside Down, began to stalk the teenagers of Hawkins, not in person, but in their minds. He was a fisherman, casting a net of consciousness, searching for the telltale scent of deep, unresolved trauma. His multi-part plan was terrifyingly precise. He needed 4 victims, 4 sacrifices, to create 4 psychic gates. When these 4 gates were opened in a specific alignment, they would merge, creating a colossal, unstoppable rift. The rallying the troops was a solitary, focused act of will. Vecna was the entire army now. He selected his targets with the care of a connoisseur of suffering: Chrissy Cunningham, haunted by her mother's abuse; Fred Benson, consumed by guilt over a fatal car accident; Patrick McKinney, a victim of domestic violence. Each one was a psychic weak point, a door waiting to be unlocked. The character of the Upside Down during this phase was that of a patient, meticulous serial killer. The grandfather clock from the Creel house became its calling card, its chimes a countdown to death, a symbol of Vecna's complete control over his victim's perception of time and reality. The plan for each victim was a 3-stage psychic assault. First, he would establish a link, causing headaches, nightmares, and nosebleeds. Second, he would begin the psychological torture, trapping them in waking nightmares, hellish mindscapes crafted from their own worst memories and fears. He would force them to relive their trauma, twisting it into a grotesque spectacle, all while appearing to them as a shadowy, monstrous figure. This process was designed to break their will, to weaken their minds to the point where they could no longer resist his final intrusion. The final phase was the psychic execution. He would pull their consciousness fully into his own mind layer, a blood-red, surreal dimension of floating rocks and a spectral replica of his childhood home. There, he would finally reveal himself, delivering a final, taunting monologue about their flawed humanity before gruesomely murdering their physical bodies in the real world. Their levitating, bone-snapping deaths were not just acts of violence. They were the final, crucial step in the ritual, the moment that tore open a new gate between worlds. The entire plan was a multi-front war waged in the minds of his victims. While he was torturing one, he was already seeding the nightmares of the next. He was a grandmaster playing on multiple chessboards at once, each move perfectly timed, leading to a single, inevitable checkmate. This was the final push of the Upside Down, no longer a clumsy, monstrous invasion, but a quiet, terrifyingly personal and intelligent assault, executed by a being who had finally learned that the easiest way to destroy a world is to first break the minds of the people who live in it. The final confrontation between the Upside Down, embodied by Vecna and the heroes of Hawkins, was a war fought across multiple planes of reality, a perfectly interwoven climax of Vecna's own design. From the Dimension's perspective, this was not a battle it was trying to win. It was a trap it was waiting to spring. Vecna had anticipated the hero's 4-phase plan and had incorporated it into his own, using their actions as the final catalyst for his victory. The first front was the psychic duel in Vecna's own mind lair. He willingly allowed 11 to enter his mind, a move of supreme arrogance. He knew he was stronger there. He engaged her in a titanic struggle, a battle of raw power and ideology. He overpowered her, pinning her to the twisted landscape of his psyche with vines, forcing her to watch as he carried out the final stage of his plan. From his perspective, this was the ultimate triumph. His creator, his nemesis, rendered helpless, forced to bear witness to his apotheosis. The second front was the physical assault on his meditating body in the attic of the Upside Down's Creel house. The attack by Nancy, Steve, and Robin, dousing him in fire, shooting him, was a painful but calculated part of his plan. He knew he was vulnerable, but he also knew that the pain would be temporary, a necessary sacrifice. The physical damage was a secondary concern. The primary objective was the completion of the ritual, and for that, he needed Max Mayfield. The third and most critical front was the battle for Max's consciousness. She was his fourth and final sacrifice. He pulled her into his mind lair, into a twisted, nightmarish recreation of the snowball, a perversion of a happy memory. He stalked her, taunted her with her own guilt over her brother's death, and broke down her mental defenses. Even as her friends fought for her in the real world, his psychic grip was absolute. He began the ritual, her body levitating, her bones snapping. The interweaving perspectives were a symphony of his control. Every action the heroes took was an action he had predicted. The pain from Nancy's attack momentarily weakened his hold on 11, but not enough. Eddie Munson's heroic Master of Puppets concert, designed to distract the Demobats, was a noble but ultimately futile gesture. Vecna was a being of immense focus, capable of managing these multiple fronts simultaneously. The pain, the distractions, they were all just noise. His signal was the stopping of Max's heart, and in the final moments, he achieved it. He broke her body, extinguished her consciousness, and for 1 full minute, she was dead. He had his fourth victim. The ritual was complete. The final confrontation was a victory for the Upside Down. The immediate aftermath of the final battle was, from the Upside Down's point of view, a moment of absolute, unparalleled triumph. Though his physical form had been grievously wounded, burned, shot, and thrown from a great height, his grand overarching plan had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. His consciousness retreated from his battered vessel, a tactical withdrawal to allow the body to heal, but his will was already at work, reaping the rewards of his victory. The primary resolution was the fulfillment of his life's work. Max Mayfield's temporary death had been the final key in the lock. The 4 psychic gates he had meticulously created at the locations of his victims' deaths erupted with a fiery, violent energy. They tore through the fabric of Hawkins, 4 bleeding wounds in reality that raced towards each other, converging on the town's center. The result was a cataclysmic merger, a tectonic upheaval that shattered the very foundations of the town. A massive, fiery, cross-shaped chasm ripped through Hawkins, swallowing buildings, roads, and forests. This was not a side effect. This was the intended result. The barrier between worlds, the one he had been battling against for decades, was not just breached. It was annihilated. The Upside Down was no longer a parallel dimension. It was now physically, irrevocably, bleeding into our world. From his perspective, the reunions of the heroes, Their grief over the comatose Max and the dead Eddie were the sweet sounds of victory. He had not just defeated them, he had broken them. He had taken one of their own and left her an empty shell. He had turned another into a martyr for a cause the rest of the town would condemn. The losses the heroes sustained were his gains. The immediate result was the beginning of his ultimate endgame, the terraforming of Earth. The sky over Hawkins turned a familiar, ominous red. The air grew thick with the toxic, snow-like spores of his dimension. The plant life began to wither and die, choked out by the creeping, supernatural decay of the Upside Down. He had successfully created a beachhead, a massive, ever-expanding zone of his own reality in the heart of enemy territory. The resolution was not the end of the war, but the beginning of its final apocalyptic phase. He had lost a battle for his physical body, but he had won the war for the soul of a town, and in doing so had opened the door to conquering the world. The Upside Down was no longer at the gate. It was the gate. The true cost of Vecna's victory, from the perspective of the Upside Down, was negligible. A small price to pay for the dawn of a new age. The primary cost was the severe damage to his physical form. The assault by Nancy, Steve, and Robin had left him wounded and vulnerable, forcing him into a period of retreat and regeneration. This was a tactical inconvenience, a temporary setback that exposed a weakness he would need to address. For a being who prided himself on being an untouchable, godlike entity, this physical vulnerability was a new and irritating variable. However, this cost was vastly overshadowed by the immense strategic gains. The wider environmental consequences in Hawkins were not a cost, but a glorious success. The town was in ruins, its landscape scarred by 4 massive, intersecting gates. The sky was perpetually red, the air filled with the familiar, comforting spores of his home dimension. The local flora was dying, being replaced by the creeping, vine-like tendrils of the Upside Down. This was not destruction. It was terraforming. It was the successful colonization of a new world, the first step in remaking the entire planet in his own dark, orderly image. The political consequences, the town's evacuation, the government's flimsy earthquake cover story were, to him, the predictable, chaotic death throes of a lesser species. He watched the humans flee, their societies crumble, and saw it as proof of his own philosophy. They were weak, pathetic creatures, incapable of facing the true nature of reality. The personal losses of his enemies were the jewels in his crown of victory. Eddie Munson's death was the insignificant swatting of a gnat. Max Mayfield's comatose, soulless state was a far greater prize. He had not just killed her, he had consumed her, leaving behind an empty vessel as a testament to his power, a permanent, walking wound in the heart of her friends' fellowship. He had proven that their love, their friendship, the very things they used as a weapon against him, could not save them. He could take anyone he wanted, anytime he wanted. Unraveling the true cost from the Upside Down's point of view reveals that there was no real cost. It was a transaction. He had traded a temporary physical setback for a permanent, world-altering victory. The gate was now a chasm. The barrier was gone. He had paid a small price in pain for the ultimate prize, a world ripe for the taking. The true cost was borne entirely by the heroes, a cost measured in dead friends, broken bodies, and a lost home. For the Upside Down, it was simply the price of progress. The long-term legacy of the Upside Down, now fully merged with the will of its master, Vecna, is one of apocalyptic success. Its journey from a mindless, chaotic dimension to a sentient, weaponized kingdom has reached its terrifying zenith. The new status quo is a world on the brink of total annihilation, with the town of Hawkins serving as the epicenter of a dimensional bleed that threatens to consume the entire planet. The Upside Down is no longer a parallel world. It is an invading one, its physical and atmospheric properties actively overriding our own. This is its ultimate impact, the permanent scarring of reality itself. The lasting scars are visible in the sky, on the ground, and in the very air of Hawkins. The red, stormy skies, the constant fall of spores, the creeping decay of nature, the massive, fiery rifts in the earth, these are not temporary effects. They are the new reality. The Upside Down has successfully established a permanent, ever-expanding beachhead. Its legacy is the end of the world as we know it. The character of the dimension has completed its transformation. It is no longer just a reflection of Vecna's mind. It is his kingdom, made manifest on earth. He is no longer a king in exile. He is a conquering god, his power growing with every inch of territory his dimension consumes. The impact on the heroes is one of utter devastation and a grim, final resolve. They are no longer fighting to keep the monster out. They are a small, isolated resistance movement living in occupied territory. The world has permanently changed, and the rules of the fight have been rewritten. The Upside Down's victory has forced them into a corner, their backs against the wall, with nowhere left to run. The lasting legacy of the Upside Down timeline is the successful execution of a plan decades in the making. From the moment Henry Creel was banished, every event has been a step towards this final apocalyptic moment. Every monster, every psychic phenomenon, every gate was part of a long, patient war that the Upside Down, under Vecna's command, has now definitively won. The new status quo is not a cold war. It is a hot, open war for the fate of the planet. And the Upside Down has the home field advantage because it is turning the entire planet into its home field. The final impact is the terrifying realization that the monster hasn't just won a battle. It has changed the very nature of the game. The board is no longer just Hawkins. It's the world. And the Upside Down is no longer just a player. It's the board, the pieces, and the player all at once. It began as a silent shadow sister to our own world, a place of chaos without a mind. It was a loaded gun waiting for a hand. That hand belonged to a boy filled with a cold human rage, and when he was cast into its depths, the dimension found its brain, its will, its purpose. It became a kingdom, a weapon, a patient, predatory force that spent decades learning, adapting, and waiting. It sent soldiers and avatars testing the defenses of our world and was beaten back time and time again, its plans thwarted by a small girl and the strange, illogical power of human love. But with each defeat, it evolved, its strategies growing more insidious, more personal, more intelligent. It learned that the easiest way to break down a wall is to first break the minds of those who live behind it. And now, the wall is gone. The two worlds are one, a dying hybrid reality shaped by the will of a single, monstrous consciousness. But as the spores of the upside down fall like snow on a dying world, and its dark king prepares for his final checkmate, one question remains. When a dimension has been so completely shaped by a single, hateful mind, can the dimension itself ever be saved? Or must it be destroyed, along with the monster it has become?